word.
Yeah, so I chose the word paradox.
Ooh.
So this idea of kind of the contrast, combining contradictory features or qualities, which I feel that has been part of my life, being a TCK and being caught between cultures. So where does that come out? I think it's all sorts of tensions. Growing up, the tension of being a Protestant within a very existential country, and because you went through French and learned about the culture,
yes.
and that very different mindset. So having that paradox in my person, the paradox of being an American citizen growing up in France and living in that tension. So I think tension, paradox are two words I kind of go back and forth with. A woman starting her career in a primarily male-dominated environment. That's changed since then, but when I first started, that was very much of a tension and a kind of a paradox. So those are a few examples of just how my life has been a bit of a paradox, living in the tension. And I think of kind of this dialectical mode of the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Yeah.
I'm always working in trying to reconcile. And I think that's why my number one strength through Clifton's strength is connectedness. Like I'm always seeking to take all of these parts and make them one. So I think that's been true in my life. I think of in my journey, even as a follower of Christ, and looking at where that comes out in my faith, and looking at scripture even in paradox, I see paradox throughout there too. I think of the incarnation of God, man, him, the creator and the author of the universe, limiting himself into this babe and living life and being a learner for 30 years before he even started his ministry, even though he is the author and all-knowing, so that paradox, I think of the paradox of the servant God, servanthood, yet, again, Father of the universe, creator of the universe. I think of even us, and I'm getting these ideas, I've been informed by a book by Hughes, where it's the title is The Vocation of the Christian Scholar, and he talks a lot about this idea of paradox as being one that we need to embrace in scholarship as well. So even these ideas of the few paradoxes I mentioned here come from that book. Simultaneously justified and yet a sinner. That's another paradox we live with. So I just think through and through there's this paradoxical structure of the Christian gospel that invites us into this dynamic paradoxical thinking, but it's the kind of thinking that keeps us open and can sustain this openness, this diversity, academic freedom. But personally, I think the reason that resonates with me so much is because of what I've experienced in my journey of being split and caught between two different cultures. And I know that's primarily what has motivated this way of thinking. I know in the French school system, and we may have talked about this, but even the way they think from these angles, always looking at things from different perspectives, and let's try to then pull it together and synthesize. So that's kind of in a nutshell the word. When you asked of a word, right away I went to paradox and tension, and I've been reflecting quite a bit on that. In my PhD, we had to start out with writing a paper on our own epistemology, because that is going to be the lens that you put on that informs your scholarship, and this paradox that came out in my epistemology paper. So there was a sense where it was like, what, I've sensed this, and you can feel a little bit like divided, but if anything, it's like it completes. Like I'm thankful, I'm grateful for the way that the contrast will pull together truths and make them whole rather than what seems opposite.
Yeah, definitely.
You know what I mean? Because that happens a lot to me. I'm like reading, even in scripture, that seems, no, it completes each other, you know, and that's oftentimes the way it is. So living kind of in that tension, I think I've found to be really developmental and helpful at a lot of different facets of my life. I'm going to stop there and see if you would like to ask questions or bring clarification. If you want it to be, I want to make sure I hit your project.
Definitely. What can you think of any specific examples where you've really had to lean into, like a moment or a specific experience? And then you talked a lot about like your academic career or like career path. But as a wife, as a mom, how has Paradox played into that?
Well, let me go back to the first 3 examples I gave of like being an American citizen within a French culture. I mean, I lived that for the first 16 years of my life, of just feeling just this split. And they talk a lot about, as a TCK, I'm a third culture kid. Have you heard of that terminology? That you don't fit, like you have issues with your identity because you're always questioning, where do I belong? So I think the way that played out in my citizenship is where people feel secure, like they can land on your identity. You know who you are, you know where you belong, and it gives you a sense of security. For a TCK, you don't have that footing. So I think where Paradox helps me in my citizenship and in my kind of like sense of belonging is to know that rather than no footing, for one, my footing is in heaven. Like I remember in college specifically having this like light bulb moment that I always wanted to be in the culture other than where I was. And so when I finally figured out my belonging is not in a physical geographical location. My citizenship is in heaven. So that was first a really big deal for me, all the way back to college. The way that plays out day to day, I mean, it's interesting how you bring pieces of the culture with you, even though a value, like sitting around the table and enjoying a good meal. My family knows that's a value to me that I can pull from France. I don't have to physically be in France to experience, convivialité. I don't know if you remember, did we talk about that word? Like that sense of relationship around the table and enjoyment, and that's a French value that even though I'm here physically in the United States, I can bring here. Relationship, the value of relationship and the collective nature of the French culture I bring. And I suppose even in my leadership, I'm learning what that looks like. I'm not going to say that I have it all figured out in my new role, but I will say as a woman in this role, it's going to look different. And I think one way that paradox has also showed up in my leading is the fact that the people that I've looked to in the past have all been men who are leaders, so I have to break away from that. And I think I've shared at leadership retreats this story about when Aaron had us go find a tree that looked like our style of leadership.
I don't think so. No.
And I was lost. I mean, this is like 8 years ago when I first started my position here, and I'm like, I didn't see myself as a leader. I'm a French professor. I'm an instructor. I'm an educator. I didn't see myself as a leader because I didn't have any models that were women really in my life at that point. But I remember saying, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna, meet the challenge. And I just kept walking around to and all these big trees. I'm like, no. And then I found this little dainty tree kind of off the beaten side of the path. I thought, you know what? I identify with that. And it's not because, me. It's because I'm going to bring a different skill set, a different way of seeing the world, a different way. And so I identified with that at that moment, realizing there are different ways to accomplish different outcomes, right? And so I think for me, the paradox there is living in, when you talk about leadership, in more of a male-dominated definition, and learning what that looks like, being a woman, being true to who I am. Because a lot of the leadership styles, a lot of times they're more authoritative, not dictatorship, but more top-down. And I'm going to be more collective, more relational, but I still have to have strategy and clarity. And so I'm learning how to do that. I'm trying to think of more examples from home. I think the paradox of being a working mother, that was the whole journey of itself. What did that look like? Of just in a time period when that wasn't very popular. So it's like, oh, you know, working through that and knowing that there was a piece that our family, that's where God was calling us. But I couldn't have done it without my parents were surrogate parents, and so like that idea of it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
I wasn't alone in it, but there was a paradox there too of living in two different worlds, professionally and kind of like, you know, domestically, I guess you could say, I don't know, home and work, and learning how to navigate that. But I always had full support of my husband. He's the one who encouraged me to go on, like even with my master's and even with this PhD, he's been all in, you know. And there's sacrifice. There is. Trying to think of some of the other personal paradoxes I mentioned at the beginning. Yeah, a woman starting her career in a male-dominated work setting and what that looks like, and even learning how to define leadership. Former language faculty whose role is shared. Oh, that's another one I didn't really mention, but being a language faculty whose role is shared across academic and student affairs, I have a foot in academics and student affairs. So that's another area in my work where I have a foot in both areas, and it's been a journey. And in each one of these, the thing with tension, it's not like paradox. I think that's why I keep thinking I go back and forth between paradox and tension, is because sometimes you're going to veer more to one side, and then you're going to have to kind of come back, and it's just like this. It's not like neat and tidy and linear. It's kind of making this finding where is that tension, and it is in process, and it is transformative, and it's a journey. Yeah. Would you like other examples?
No, I think that's perfect. Is there anything else that you had written on your sheet that you wanted to cover?
Oh, these were just notes about some of the paradoxes, but I think to keep it, I mean, this is kind of a silly one, but like even with France, the paradox of like people think, oh, so they think Paris. And like, I grew up in this village, and we have this funny story among some of the faculty. They were talking about working in the farm and all, and I'm like, well, I was a farm girl, and I'm telling them about in high school where I went and picked grapes, and they keep teasing me about this. Oh, yeah, you know, like yes, I was in France, and I stepped on grape. You know, like you know what I mean? It's almost like I think people have a picture of even what France is like. It was even the village life, in contrast to what I know now, was such a contrast and so different. Very much of the simplicity of a little village of 350 inhabitants going to school in a 4-grade classroom. It's like Little House in the Prairie. I mean, honestly, my friend had an outhouse.
Oh, wow.
Like, back in time. Like, this is my life, and people think, oh, the French professor, Paris, Eiffel Tower, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you guys have no idea. Like, I grew up in a very simple environment that also fed my worldview. And so, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, even thinking through how to synthesize even this, I mean, I feel like I live in this caught between. I'm caught between. You know, caught between cultures, don't always feel like I completely belong, or but yet I've accepted that, and I've kind of maximized in that, and brought that into the different parts of my life, whether it's, you know, home life, work, the way I see the world, even how I read scripture and see it there too. And
how would you challenge or encourage someone else to live in the tension or live in the paradox?
That's a good question. I think perspectives. So to live in paradox means you have to entertain different perspectives, right? It can't just be this fixed, got it. And so I think that navigating with an intellectual humility is critical, because what that does is that opens up an ability to listen truly to other people's perspectives, views, and be a learner and have kind of a growth mindset rather than this fixed mindset. But it also places you in a position of recognizing that there's always more. Like, even in his mystery and my finiteness, that there's always something more to learn. There's always something more to discover. And so it brings also kind of I don't know, kind of a passion about life, but also an understanding that it sometimes uncertainty and mystery, but yet kind of founded in truths that give you a footing. Does that make sense? So even in that, so I think I would challenge people to look. Like, if you feel like you're not being challenged with another perspective, go looking for another perspective.
Yeah.
Go put yourself in a situation. That's why I'm such an advocate for language and cultural studies and anything that's going to get you out of your kind of comfort zone, because that's when you're going to get challenged. And when you get challenged, it creates a disequilibrium within that then gives room for growth. That's not to say that, you just anything goes. That's not relativism. You can be a person of conviction, sound doctrinally and founded, but yet open yourself up to just a curiosity about life, about wanting to really discover truth as expressed through his word, through creation, through people around you, and as so I think seeking just to be a learner. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think that is a beautiful way to end.